Starting to record now. We'll make sure to send you the recording. Anybody that registered will receive a copy of the recording and the slides as well. So welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Price. I'm the Academic Programs Manager for the SUNY Center for Professional Development. My background is actually political science and political philosophy, to be more precise. So I'm sort of a closet humanities guy. Unfortunately, I no longer teach political philosophy, but I teach liberal studies for Brockport. So there's philosophy involved in that and some humanities stuff as well. So great to have you all here. I'm surprised that, folks are still willing to come to Zoom meetings. I think we'd all be a little bit tired of them by now, but I think the topic today probably, drew some folks out of their Zoom hibernation and it's good to see you all. So we do have a lot on deck for the hour and a half we have together, and I'll let each of the presenters just sort of introduce themselves in turn as they go through, and I'm going to be advancing the slides so that we make sure that everything goes smoothly and on time. I encourage everybody, we'll have time after each presentation, which will be about 6 minutes. We'll have about 6 minutes for questions, maybe a little less if they go over 6 minutes, and then we'll move on. I guess that's about it for now, but I'm just going to introduce one of my colleagues on the planning team for this, Tim Stooksbury from SUNY Press 64 Inc., to introduce himself and just tell you a little about what he does.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session today. We're really excited to have the opportunity to bring the second workshop that we've done on best practices using digital pedagogy in the humanities classroom. I think that I've peeked through the slides, and I think everyone's in for some really enlightening education this afternoon. SUNY Press got involved with this initiative in a roundabout way, but we are a publisher in the humanities and social sciences, and we're very interested in how the field is moving. We've seen over the past year and a half an incredible swing in terms of classroom use of moving from print to digital materials. And we know that that is a trend that is likely to continue in the future. And there's a lot more that you can do with digital than just put print online. So it's a real treat to be able to hear from some of the experts today. Thanks, Chris, for letting me have a little plug for SUNY Press. We recently started a new imprint called 64 Inc., which is all about helping folks out at SUNY with their publishing needs. So check us out online, and I'm going to end my remarks now so we can get to the good stuff. But I'm looking forward to hearing all the sessions.
Great, thanks, Tim. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. And like I said, if you have any questions while the presenter is presenting, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will read them out. Or it's a small enough group that if folks want to open their mic and also ask questions that way, I think that'll work as well. So first up, we have Nicole Childrose from Columbia-Greene Community College, and take it away, Nicole.
Thank you, Chris. So good Friday afternoon to everyone. I'm Nicole Childrose, and I am a faculty member from Columbia-Greene Community College. So we are literally in the backyard of Olana, and so we're just immersed in history. And I've had the pleasure to teach history, political science, philosophy, and social science, as well as humanities courses since 2008. So sadly, I'm housed in a social science division, but of course we work very closely with the humanities, and that's what most resonates with me. So I'm really excited to talk to you a bit today about the possibilities of using raw materials, primary sources, direct from history in any course. So this could be in art, philosophy, communication, whatever it is. It doesn't matter, because primary sources are original artifacts and objects, and they were, since they're created at the time under study, they provide no interpretation. So this allows your students to be empowered and feel engaged and analyze and interpret events or themes from any given time or place. So before we advance the slides, just in terms of the last few years, the availability of these artifacts have just exploded digitally. So it's really easy to find any of these things. And the great thing is they also usually provide citations that students can quickly grab or you can use. It really just makes the work that we're doing easy. So helping and setting up students to be successful to analyze these sources, I have found also prompts curiosity, improves critical thinking, overall detail and analysis skills, and it leads to, in my experience, just amazing discussion, having all students feel like they can offer something. And I think overall, it just really creates a memorable, rich course experience, whether it's a fully online, hybrid, or even a high flex learning environment. So if we could move to the next slide. Thank you. So here I'm just going to show you, and I just want to talk a little bit about the theory, like the way that I think about these. This is an actual primary source photo that I would use. And at the end of my slide deck, I share some resources that are really easy to use when trying to find these things. So this is one that I would use in a history HI 104 for us, second half of US history course. I've also used this same photo in American government and a philosophy course that I taught over the summer. So I really think about this when I love adult learning theory, Malcolm Knowles, 1968, and thinking about how all of our learners, when they're coming to our classes, they want to have some degree of control of what they're learning and how they are learning. And we know from these theories, right, that students can really gain more when they're pulling out past experiences or drawing on things that they previously know to add that greater context to their learning. And then just two other things with adult learning theory. I know that memorizing facts, that's just not going to work in any environment. So bringing this kind of really impactful photography or images is just the opposite, right? Students need to solve problems, they need to use their reasoning, and they want to know, how can I use this information right now? And so through this kind of engagement, we can connect with them and assess what they're learning and give them skills that they can use right away. So as you can see in this photo, these are immigrants coming into Ellis Island. And I like to share with students that my family were in a second wave of immigrants coming to Ellis Island. So I think they really get like from a personal sort of connection. So I think anytime we can connect to these sources, it's really ideal. And before I progress to the next slide, I just want to take you all on a quick trip down my memory lane. Way before I was a teacher as a college student, I actually recall being in an American history class. And it was a really unique class because we would come in, and I hope some folks remember this. They actually had transparencies that were up. So the poor professor, actually had to cart these things in, and we have it so much easier where we can just be pulling from internet archives. But we would walk into that classroom, the lights would be pretty dim, and we would see this large image every class up on the screen. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. This is taking me out of like wherever I'm coming from and just putting me in that moment. So anyhow, one day I walk into the classroom and there's this photo up that just completely captured my attention. And it was an enormous pile of buffalo skulls. And at the very top of this pile was just a little tiny man in the photo holding one of them up like a trophy. There must have been hundreds of thousands, I've tried to count, I can't count, of buffalo skulls in this photo. And then standing on the ground was another man. And I later learned through the class that this was a postcard image that was celebrating the near completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1800s. So I knew right at this moment that A, I needed to be a history teacher. B, I needed to be an animal rights activist. And then C, that pictures are just so powerful and that I would use these kinds of archives in classes that I would teach. So if we could just progress to the next slide. And actually, I have that photo above in my office, above my computer, just to remind me of the impact that that had on me. So in the assignment that I'm sharing, when we're thinking about using this in an online space or environment, I think it's really important to just have a to-do list in mind. So organizing all of your materials. So what I'm using is OER reading, and I'm thinking of a week-long sort of engagement lesson with these digital artifacts. And I would give a timeline accompanied with some lecture notes, either a video or a podcast, some kind of multimedia to just ground this. And then of course, the primary source artifact, whatever it may be. So in this assignment, of course, we're exploring immigration in the US. And then what I want to think about is the ways to engage students. So I might pose an essential question for all to see in the beginning. Is America a land of opportunity? Maybe that's the question, maybe something else, whatever relates to your learning outcomes. And then I want to help students connect the dots, thinking about inquiry, applying knowledge, and testing assumptions. So I'm going to give them some challenges. First, maybe if we're meeting synchronously, in like a live remote session, I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to either post in the chat or unmute about something they spot in the image. And then as a more formal way to hear from everyone, I'll have a rubric, and maybe this could be a discussion for the week. So if we can actually progress to the next slide. So for example, the challenge might be to, hey, check out this primary source. What is it that you see? And I will say, when actually doing this in practice, it is surprising what students, bring up. I could never predict sometimes. So always being prepared for that is great. But in this unexpected interaction, I think there's a great reciprocity from me to students. And there's some really great takeaways, and I think everything feels engaged and involved. So we can ask really structured questions like, who created this, or who took this photo? Why did they take it? What was the purpose? And if we're not using photos, maybe we're using archive maps as pictured here. So I'm just being sensitive of the time. So on the next slide, and I could talk about primary sources all day. I really like to put, student inquiry first and foremost with primary sources, whether it's in a philosophy class, political science, history, and get them thinking about what happened during the period, have them speculate, have them connect those dots. And then you'll notice one of the questions I always ask is, what do you think the perspective, or what was the bias, or what stereotypes do you see? Students get very passionate about sharing on that last point. And then on my next slide, so as I'm planning the assignment or working with primary sources, I'm really clear and intentional on how I'm rolling out various archives and how I'm assessing overall. So I'm purposeful, I'm helping, and I'm scaffolding throughout the week as students identify further questions that they have, and I might provide additional resources to help them. In fact, a few weeks ago, we were talking about immigration in one of my classes, and it came up, and we actually found this political cartoon. I think students don't always get at first the meaning of historical political cartoons, but then we can talk about it and apply it to current things. And that just really makes for rich, meaningful conversation. And I think on the next slide, my final slide, just some helpful resources for thinking about excellent essential questions. I love this guide, and you can access this link. It's just a PDF, one page of great questions that can't be easily answered. And then for a terrific variety of archival sources, Library of Congress, digital collections, and there's so many more. I really encourage working with your library. I've developed research guides and actual guides that I embed right in Blackboard to help students locate these and to help me create a repository of these. That's all I have, Chris.
All right, thanks, Nicole. That was great. We're 1 minute from the end, so if anybody have any questions for Nicole, I mean, we can also do it in the chat too if folks have questions after we start the next session. We have a little cushion time. Does anybody want to ask Nicole a question? Okay, well, it's 1:16 now, so we can move on to the next session. And if you do have questions for Nicole, please put it in the chat. I'm sure she'll answer them there. And I will make sure that, again, we share this, the slide deck with everyone who registered so that you have links to everything in there as well. Thanks, Nicole. It's great. Okay. So next up is Elissa.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Nicole. That was wonderful. And it was, you kind of set me up here wonderfully with a lot of the principles that we didn't rig it. I've never met Nicole, but it was a wonderful setup for me here today, given her focus on engaging students, bringing primary materials into the classroom. As you can see from my opening slide here, I teach at SUNY Maritime. I'm in our fort here. That's why my window is so small behind me, purely defensive posturing here today down at Maritime. And I'm here today to really speak about how I use digital humanities in the classroom to allow for, much like Nicole was, more interactive, meaningful engagements with primary sources. And what I'm going to do today is share with you all a project that I worked on a few years ago, and we could advance to the next slide, to a digital book I essentially put together in Scalar, which is a free online technology out of USC. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. For those of you that do teach American history, if you Google Scalar, and that's S-C-A-L-A-R, and Let Freedom Ring, they have a wonderful, someone used Scalar technology to make a wonderful interactive text of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech that I share with students. So for our American historians, there's an absolutely wondrous interactive audio version of the speech you could share with students using this technology. And so what I did here, just to give you the background of the text itself, what I did was I took several chapters of a book called The General History of the Pirates. And I could and would speak for hours on just the general history of the pirates, but it's an early 18th century text that I share with students both in an upper level elective on piracy that I teach here at Maritime College, particularly on the golden age of piracy, history, culture, literature, and context around piracy. And then with graduate students, because we have a master's here at Maritime in Maritime and Naval Studies. And so like Nicole was speaking about it in her opening presentation here, you know, there is this wonderful interaction that we all know you have with students when you invite them to engage with primary sources. There is, as she also testified to, there's going to be those missteps and there are going to be those difficulties. And one of the things with this text is, you know, it is an 18th century text. It is a slog for students to get through, even though it's about pirates, it can be a slog. And so in my first slide here, you see my introductory page really of the digital book that I put together. Again, focused specifically on this selection of chapters where the pirates engage with Madagascar. And that's a separate presentation as to the how and why I selected them. And again, as I mentioned here in the opening slide, you know, I was lucky to have support from my college with this. I know many of us here today probably could do a whole other conference just on the logistics and sometimes vagaries around getting support and funding for digital humanities projects. I was lucky enough to have support. We had a SUNY ITG grant on campus when I said, wow, Scalar looks great, but what do the buttons do? And I needed some support to get started with the logistics. And then obviously, you know, all the wondrous free tech that's set up for us as scholars to use. And so, you know, I do introduce this to students. What I'd like to speak to today is sort of the way I use one text and the way I really, as a teacher / editor, really designed this little digital world for them via this project to support a whole variety of projects. They use this for sort of small discussions. They use it as a jumping point for larger projects, again, both at the undergraduate and the very, very advanced graduate level. So if we move to the next slide, one element that you'll see here is that, you know, I'm initially just trying to contextualize, right, for them. And that can be very straightforward things that you might expect, providing relevant terminology, trying to ensure that, especially where the texts speak to maybe diverse topics and places in the world that students may be more or less familiar with, that I'm able to clarify. So for example, when we meet the famous Captain Avery, who did briefly destabilize the burgeoning trade between England and the powers that be in India at the time, in the small text there, it says, Avery made as great a noise in the world as Marivice does now, and it goes through, and he married the great mogul's daughter. And I would lose students right there, because these are names and places that they're not familiar with. And I know from when I was teaching with a text-based version, a purely text-based version of this work, that I would come back and say, you know, the first year or two, say, what did everyone get? And they'd say, you know, not much, especially the undergraduates. And I started doing an immense amount of work just getting them ready to read. And I didn't like that. I didn't like the fact that it felt like spoon feeding. I didn't think that's what they really needed. And so one of the wonderful things Scalar lets me do, as again, sort of this hybrid teacher / editor, you can see I've highlighted a picture there, and I've highlighted the gentleman in the center there, who is Aurangzeb, the great Mughal. And a student, when they go over that word, great Mughal, in the text, they can read past it. If they are comfortable learning from context, or they have an education background, or they're a graduate student and they're more comfortable, they can move right past it. It's not intrusive in their process. But the one thing I do now, spoon feed ahead of time, is touch the book. You can't break it. You can't break the website. Click on things. And so a student can then engage with this, and it highlights, boom, that little box pops up through Scalar there, and they get my little text explanation and background on that particular historical figure. So there's something very useful just there in that, you know, I can provide just a little bit of basic introduction context for them, again, on these points. In the next slide, then, I speak to sort of a different element, or provide you with some evidence of a different element here. And the idea here is that we're including more voices in the text. And so, you know, Avery, along the way, if you read the English versions of his tale, he essentially raids this ship that's on pilgrimage to Mecca, but he's an absolute perfect gentleman, a mere pickpocket, if you will, leaves everyone completely unharmed. It could not be a more gentlemanly conflict. And what I've done on the side here is, again, up on the top, the text says, having taken all the treasures on board their ship and plundered the prize of everything they wanted or liked, right? They let her go. It was just like that. They took what they wanted and then they let her go. If you click that, I've now highlighted for you, I've given you a contemporary account from another culture now, right? From the perspective of the Mogul's court, in terms of what their historical records say about this event. And Scalar, again, lets me be not too intrusive with it. It's there as an illustration. I don't like to underestimate how much it helps sometimes just to break up the page, right? That can be a good thing as well. And so it allows me to give that context. And if they do click on that, they can get further information. In the next slide, something I really care deeply about in this project, which was to really engage them in some inquisitive reading. Again, there's a lot of just casual assumptions on the part of the author about the native peoples that they encounter, and it provided me with a way to give in areas where I felt, and I knew from having taught the course in the past, that students would slide right past often these parts. And as Nicole pointed out, when you want to be purposeful and in where you're engaging students in a text, I have a section here where I'm speaking to, you know, the author just sort of says, oh, these native peoples, they, you know them, they fight with each other in this sort of, you know, high and mighty tone. And so I give some context into that. Well, why is that? Why are they fighting with each other? And how are these European incursions, are they partially responsible for it? And so that's another very useful step there, where, again, as a teacher / editor, you can decide how lightly or heavily you'd like to edit the text in that way. In the next slide, then, you know, something that came to me as part of the project, you know, in addition to giving this context, trying to contextualize the world that they were in, bring voices to all of the people that are otherwise voiceless in the text, such as the native peoples he's encountering. And there's some wonderful examples of that I could speak to. I'm trying to launch them into their own independent research. And this is something that's there sort of optional for the undergraduates, and it's very much how my graduate students use it. And so, for example, Avery, allegedly, when he first mutinies and becomes pirate, there's a record of a ballad That is supposedly what he sang. He burst into song like a great musical aboard the ship and sang about just how hard he was going to mutiny and just how great a pirate he was going to be. And so I've put that's not from this text. In this text, he mutinies and he moves on to pirating. But I said, hey, I'm allowed to, as an editor, I can put in that intersection for another contemporary text and say, here's a ballad of the time. And Scalar allows me to then, students can connect to my list of primary documents. And as I hope you can see on the bottom right there, I'm able, even by simply using the web link, I should really stress here, folks, I cannot program. I have no programming ability. If you can attach an attachment to an email, you can use Scalar with a little practice at the beginning. That's really all you need to know how to do. I'm able to do something like embed this wonderful collection of ballads straight to that source. So all of a sudden a graduate student who sees that says, wow, this gave me this useful information on Avery, but wait a minute. Now when I'm taking this other course on whaling or, another course on arcs and archives in the maritime world, I now have another resource I can use, and I'm helping them build their vocabulary and their comfort with something we stress a lot in the program, and I think is increasingly stressed across many programs, and that comfort with digital source work. And I think that sort of wraps me up if there are any questions on any of that.
Yeah, we have a few minutes, so any questions for Elissa? I'll just say, and this may be a gross generalization, but I would think that a course on the history of pirates would be a popular course at Maritime. But
well, you know what? It's an interesting course at Maritime because, of course, we also teach, maritime security, and these are students who, many of whom need to know, what the procedures are aboard a ship when you're dealing with real pirates potentially someday. So, I try not to. I try to make it clear I'm giving historical context with the pirate flags, that I am not endorsing this choice of lifestyle. But it is, and it's very surprising to them because they do tend to come to it very heavily thinking about it in terms of being a security issue. And it is fundamentally what drew me to it is it's a working people's issue. It is an issue of, in its time, the reasons why people turned pirate were much less romantic and much more mundane. So that tends to engage students as well with these materials.
Elissa, I have a question about copyright. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just curious about how copyright works with Scalar. There's probably a lot. There's probably a long answer to that question, but
no, I think the reality is there's both a long answer and a short answer. I think there's always areas where we want to be careful. But certainly everything I used in the project was open source. One of the nice things about Scalar is that it lets you in any, I don't know if you can tell from the smaller version you're seeing here, but like under the ballad there, you can see there's a bunch of gobbledygook underneath where the ballad is posted in the middle of the page. And that's me linking to the source where I found it, giving the attribution and whatnot. And as it's an educational material, thus far, all my training and use of it has been endorsed by anyone I engaged with it. But you would want to be careful if you were doing a more contemporary project, or you were finding materials that were potentially not there to be shared.
So we need to move on. I see Keith has his hand raised, but Keith, if we could hold that or ask in the chat. We may have a little extra time at the end to ask, general questions to everyone, but we need to move on just to make sure that we have time for everybody. So thank you so much, Elissa. And our next presenter is up, and that's Amy. Amy, take it away.
Hi, thank you. And I'm actually going to talk about a programming language and how you can incorporate it into humanities courses. And I'm at Binghamton University. And I'm actually, I'm a librarian. I'm the digital scholarship librarian. And then I was brought onto this program to help develop these courses for students after I taught a workshop at the Digital Humanities Research Institute we had for faculty and graduate students in humanities to learn more about the digital humanities computational methods too. So this is a 2-course sequence that I'll share with you, and I kept it more broad rather than diving too deep into the projects, but I'm happy to get to specifics too if there's any that get brought up in questions. And you can advance, Chris, please. Thank you. So the Binghamton Codes program was an initiative started by a Binghamton alum who works at Google. He came through humanities and then the computer science program. And one thing he was noticing was that there weren't a lot of students applying to positions, who had humanities background, but also getting more of these computational skills. So he wanted to help us provide an opportunity for students in humanities and social science programs to be able to learn programming languages and coding skills so that when they do get into the job field, they'll feel a little more comfortable in interviews where those topics may be brought up, and not so much even in positions where it's a developer, but even sometimes if you work at certain companies like Google, they may ask you even in customer service, what your knowledge is on a certain programming language, just to get an idea of, do you know at least the basics to be able to have a conversation with our developers and understand what they're talking about. So even just having that high level understanding can be crucial for people in the humanities. We wanted to help build students' computational confidence and self-efficacy. A lot of the students that have come through this program so far, they came with little to no programming experience and some very little experience with other computational methods or platforms or application experience as well. So this is something brand new to them when they start the course. We launched the pilot versions in the spring and fall of 2020, and we now are in our second instance of teaching the first course. So we chose to start with Python because it is considered an easy and most human readable programming language. A lot of times it's where beginners start. If you have no experience before, it is open source and free to use. So anybody can learn Python or use it. And there's a plethora of resources and tutorials out there too to even get you started. And also just to learn Python for multiple different tracks. So it doesn't even have to be something that you learn everything. You can learn for your own specific needs as well. So our course sequence has two courses in it. The first one is Coding in Action 1. And in this course, we focus more on the fundamental skill building. So we introduce them to a couple different environments that they could be using Python within, including a text editor, Visual Studio Code, and using their terminal. And we also show them how to use a more graphical user interface like Jupyter Notebook, which is common for data science, just to give them a little bit of an interaction with the different interfaces they could be using with it. We also started a lesson in Intro to Command Line, just to give people a little bit more familiarity with what their computer actually looks like when you're not using a GUI or graphical user interface like we're used to by clicking an application and having it open up and seeing the lovely screen appear for us. We introduce them to open data and show them where they can find open data sets to then apply the Python skills they learn to analyzing the data sets, and then also have the opportunity to build simple games, and also show them how to use Python with Excel files and give them a little bit more of an introduction to Excel as well. Because a lot of the times our humanities students don't have training in using Excel or Google Sheets at all as well. So this gives them a little bit more of an intro to that. The second course that comes after advances their skills. We make it more of a project-based course. We also introduce them to project management skills. So they work on a group project from start to finish throughout the semester. And they apply the different stages of project management into it as well. Because we'll show them how to gather data, not just from open data sets, but from web scraping and APIs. We introduce them to HTML and CSS for some basic backend web development. And we dive a little bit deeper into analyzing the data and game development. And there's a lot of open resources out there too, where they can be accessing different types of data and literary texts as well through this. And next slide, thank you. Both courses have included, we brought in guest lecturers who are actually in the field and working on these types of projects. We try to find folks who come from non-traditional backgrounds like humanities backgrounds who have then dive deeper into these type of positions. The course is based on open educational resources, so students do not have to pay for a textbook. Students don't pay for any of the materials they have access to. And it's a mix of learning media that we include too. So there's everything from open readings. They can watch videos and tutorials. There's audio content and podcasts that are shared, and then some hands-on activities and some projects for them to review as well. I have them do a pre and post assessment survey, and also have them fill out exit tickets after each lab. That way we get a better understanding of, what did we explain the material well for the level of your learning at this stage in learning Python? How can we improve it for future groups? And also how can we, maybe tweak some of the labs in the future to make it more focused on their areas of need? And if you're interested in looking more into this, you don't have to develop full courses like we're doing with Python. Although there may be some already offered at your university as well that are for humanities and social science students. I know we do have some other classes on campus in political science and economics, and obviously computer science, where they're also using Python for different learning needs, and some are using R, and you don't need prior experience to come in and use it for that particular need. And if you're learning it for the first time yourself, there are so many free tutorials out there. And I'm happy to share some in the chat too, if anybody's interested. But things like Geeks for Geeks and W3 Schools, a lot of those have free online tutorials that can get you started, at least understanding the basics of Python. And if you do teach courses like this, you need to learn to be comfortable with not knowing all of the answers. We Google things frequently in the class. There's all sorts of questions that can come up. And one great thing with learning a programming language is that there's never one way to come to the solution. There's multiple ways that something can be done. So we'll be looking up answers for people, helping people troubleshoot, and seeing us do it too can help empower the students to understand that it's okay. It's normal to have to look into these things, especially when you're in a learning curve for things involving technology and software. And reach out to other people who teach this too. We are a very friendly community of people doing this. And these are just some ideas for ways that if you're teaching certain classes that you can be using Python for a specific need. Anything for working with a corpus of text or analyzing and visualizing data, developing interactive games to work together as a group and do some critical thinking in class. You can map geographic data. There's some really pretty maps out there. Somebody did one in San Francisco of where all the Starbucks are located and did it in 3 different types of maps. Working with all different file types, it works well with CSVs, text files, doc files, Excel files, and just how you can automate everyday things. Like you can have Python send emails for you or generate passwords for you. Anything like that can be fun just to try out in class. Chris, how'd I do on time?
You're great. So we actually have 4 minutes left here for questions. So any questions for Amy?
I'd love to ask for some of those recommendations, because I know that's something that I'm now sort of feeling my project is something, it's almost to me like a handout. It's something I share with my students. It's relatively private. And it does seem to me that to take the next step with some of these projects and systems, I need to start learning some of this stuff. So anything that you recommend, I know I'd certainly love to take some recommendations on some early first steps in taking some tutorials and such.
Yeah, I'll put some in the chat for you if you want to save the links for them. But yeah, there's so many free resources out there to learn it these days that it's worth it if you have the time to do so.
Yeah, and also helpful to know that there are shorter courses or sort of intensive programs and things that people can do, because we often, again, hit that particularly with our graduate students where, they're going through a program in a relatively short span of time and working to take additional whole credit, whole classes. That's something I hadn't thought about. So thank you for that as a suggestion.
Yeah, definitely. If you work with corpus of text at all, it works really well to create visualizations and just analyze the text and clear out stop words and things like that. Just cleaning the text even. I found it really useful just to use it for that one specific purpose.
I wish I had known that. Not mine. That sounds fabulous. Thank you.
So I'm fond of. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask Amy if any of the curricular resources that you're having students use in the course, you've shared openly on the web? Are any of those accessible?
I'm in the process. I actually just took a Library Juice Academy course on learning how to use GitHub better. And there's ways that I can develop materials that way. So I'm actually in progress of putting some of that together. I would like to share more openly. Also as part of our library's Digital Scholarship Center in general, just making these tools more accessible for people. Because it's great that there's all these open resources too, but it's saturated too. So where do you really begin and trying to get that one-stop shop of just getting some ideas of starting out?
I would love to follow up with you and talk about some of this. We're trying to do something similar at Geneseo at our Center for Digital Learning. We're using GitHub for what we've been doing so far. So
oh, awesome.
I'll be in touch.
Awesome.
So we are almost out of time, but I was just going to say really quickly. I mean, I'm fond of food metaphors, and when it comes to teaching and learning, and I feel like if you eat out all the time, it's hard for you to see a good reason, if you can afford it, especially to make your own food. But once you discover the joys of sort of cooking for yourself, and that's the way I kind of look at coding, right? It's like, sure, there's lots of stuff out there you could just get off the shelf, and you don't have to know about any of that stuff. But once you start to dig into this a little bit, you kind of learn, you don't have to be a gourmet chef, right?
Yeah, and there's so many packages out there now that you can buy that prepackaged like a HelloFresh, and they'll have the code that you use, and it will just visualize with just typing in a few lines, that rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and learn it all from scratch.
Very good. Thank you so much. Okay, so Travis, I believe, is next. Just gonna slide up. Go, Travis.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hey.
You can see and hear me, right? Welcome again. I am an assistant professor of English and Humanities at Alfred State. And so I teach a full range of courses from first-year writing to literature, poetry, writing for new media. And today I'm going to talk about something I do in my technical writing classes. And this project is surprisingly simple. And so I'm going to try to keep it surprisingly brief. So one of the things that has informed my teaching over the past few years is I listened to the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, which I recommend. There's a lot on digital pedagogy there. And one particular episode of that podcast sticks in my mind, and it was an interview with an online professor from Oklahoma, Laura Gibbs. And she talked about how she used to teach in person across the hallway from a really notable professor. And she let her class out early one day and went across to see, the students coming out of this notable professor's class. And apparently he had just returned papers. And the students were walking out of the class and looking at their grades on the papers and then dropping them in the trash can on the way out. And this experience radicalized her in a sense and prompted her to think through the idea of more meaningful assignments that students want to actually hold on to, and that they see as like having an existence in the real world. I mean, carrying around a paper with a grade on it, they didn't even look at the feedback. They just sort of trashed it. And so I've been consciously trying to incorporate what I would think of as meaningful assignments in all of my classes. And I think that's one of the big potentials of digital pedagogy, as we've seen some of these really interesting projects up to this point. I think these tools that we're seeing can lead to more durable, meaningful, and ideally genuinely useful projects that the students are creating, so they see the work that their labor can do out in the world. And so for this class, again, this is for a technical writing class, flipping the LMS, but I think it'd be easily adaptable to a variety of contexts, and it really derives from the idea of letting the students teach the class in some sense. So you can advance the slide. So our assignment here, and I'm at an advantage in my technical writing class because it's a convention of the course to develop a service learning project, which involves creating some educational credit-bearing experience in the service of the needs of a client organization. And in last spring, I sort of served on a steering committee that launched a campus food pantry. And it was part of a student's senior project. And they actually had an emergency launch at the beginning of the pandemic to address the food insecurity needs of students at Alfred State. And so I wanted to kind of keep involved with that project into the fall. And I discussed with the staff person who's overseeing the food pantry what their communication needs were. And one of the things he pointed out to me was that though it tends to be a student-led organization, he's the one who's in charge of the training of students. And so he was looking for usable training materials that he could kind of deliver to the students that would make this process a little more seamless for him. And so through some discussions and some work with my students in brainstorming what we could do in terms of training materials, we decided that it would be a solid project for us to create a Blackboard training module for food pantry volunteers. So they can log into this course and they can watch some videos and take some quizzes, and they'll be considered trained as food pantry volunteers. So the goal here is in service of the broader goals of my technical writing class, which takes a rhetorical emphasis, our major emphasis on audience analysis, meeting the needs of an audience, and especially focused on questions of usability and accessibility. And I think those questions in particular are especially urgent in the area of digital pedagogy as we're thinking about, we're incorporating these new tools. Are they usable and accessible for all users? We also incorporated some learning theory as the students were thinking about length and content of instructional videos, the organization of the landing page, the types of questions and the number of questions on the quizzes. And so a lot of moving pieces here is a very collaborative project, but ultimately the students ended up delivering this product to the food pantry that's now in use as their training materials for new food pantry volunteers. On the next slide, you'll see the landing page on Blackboard. And so how this kind of came into being, I worked with our IT department and the Center for Online Learning here at Alfred State, and they opened up essentially a sandbox course shell, a blank course shell for my students, and gave them instructor level access to developing these materials. And so the students had to think about what's the first thing we want users to see here. They developed a couple of different videos and uploaded them here, and they had to work through the constraints of the platform. And so they planned and recorded and edited the videos, and they developed adaptive release quizzes for the trainees. On the next slide, you'll see the sort of bottom of the page. As you scroll, it's a sort of single scroll page. The adaptive quizzes appear after you watch the video. So there's a video on hygiene, video on receiving and storing and delivering. And then at the end, the quizzes culminate. If you score 80 or more, you get this sort of digital badge that shows at the food pantry. And so you can move to the next slide. Again, I think this is a great potential for digital pedagogy. As you give students access to the LMS behind the curtain, it's the students who become the digital pedagogues. It's sort of gospel in digital pedagogy that just putting your materials online or using the LMS doesn't count necessarily as digital pedagogy. But I think if you flip it and you make the students the teachers in this context, if you give them that instructor level access, then I think that would be considered digital pedagogy and allows them to develop an understanding not just of how they're being taught, but of how they can teach others. So it's a collaborative project. Again, the students create the content, but various teams of students were involved in usability testing the website and the evaluation of the Blackboard page, just to make sure that the questions were collated correctly to the videos and that they weren't too difficult. And they also wrote up, an evaluation of the text and the images that were used. My favorite part of the project is the transparency. It's giving them the instructor view, helps them see what I'm working with when I'm developing online courses and course content. And I think it lets them appreciate their instructors a little bit because they see the constraints that we're dealing with. People have varying opinions about their learning management systems. It's often a love-hate relationship. But being able to look behind the curtain and see the instructor view makes them feel a little bit more powerful, and it also gives them appreciation for what happens behind the scenes. And then this is an inclusive process as well. If you've used Blackboard, one of the things that it incorporates is accessibility scores on materials that you upload. And so we worked on meeting the needs of diverse audiences by including captions on videos and alt text for images and things like that. And Blackboard's built-in accessibility tools were excellent for that. So again, a really simple project is just being able to work with an IT department and a Center for Online Learning that were responsive, and just creating this space for the students to play around and develop themselves as digital pedagogues. And I think the lesson here is really that these tools can help students, see that as they're communicating, as they're, they could have written just a report on instructional materials, but instead they've created something that's durable and meaningful and ultimately useful. And they can see how this serves their campus community. And so that I saw was the real value of this process. And I'm hoping to let some students play around in Blackboard a little bit more this semester. And that's all I have for today. So thank you.
Thanks, Travis. Any questions? Let's see, there's one in the chat here. Any questions for Travis? I actually just wanted to ask, I put in the chat sort of jokingly that I was wondering how many campuses would give students instructor level access to the LMS. So when you first approached your the folks who support the LMS and your online teaching and technology enabled teaching staff, did you get resistance? Were they, how did that go?
This wasn't an available procedure for them, so we had to invent something. I have a good relationship with our director of online learning because we're on the e-learning committee together. So I've had a kind of long-standing relationship there. So we communicate well, and I asked about this, and she helped me create this sort of help desk ticket. And there were questions about process, because typically to give someone instructor level access requires like department chair and dean sign off. But the fact that this was not a Blackboard shell tied to a credit bearing course streamlined that process. It would have been a lot more complicated if I wanted them to have instructor level access to an actual academic course. But surprisingly streamlined. And again, it was a process we invented. I had to, this was our deliverable as well. So we had to add the food pantry staff to the Blackboard course as well. And that, again, they said, you need dean and chair sign off. And I kind of reiterated that this was not academic. And so it sort of did an end around there on the process. I don't know if that would work elsewhere.
Yeah, right. No, exactly. Well, that was really interesting. Thank you, Travis. So we're going to keep moving along. And again, we might have a little time at the end. And of course, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. But I think we're going to move on to Paul now. Paul, take it away.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Just going to paste some links in the chat to start for sites that I'll be referring to as I talk about annotation as a tool for digital pedagogy, and in particular, the power of social annotation. That is, notes that we can affix to things, primarily written texts, but also, as in the example of my slide, other media such as images. Notes that we can share with others and that others can respond to because they live in a space that's partly or fully public. So if you could advance to the next slide. You'll find some examples of how social annotation is being used by a variety of humanities instructors under the entry annotation in the Modern Language Association's new anthology, Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, a peer-reviewed, curated collection of reusable and remixable resources for teaching and research, which you'll find at the URL on the slide, and that's one of the URLs I put in the chat. Each of the 45 keyword entries in digital pedagogy in the humanities consists of a curatorial statement plus 10 curated artifacts that illustrate what that keyword means in a digital context. And as you can see here, I wrote the entry on annotation and collected the artifacts associated with it. Next slide, please. So one of the things I emphasized in my curatorial statement is that annotation is actually a very old practice, as H.J. Jackson documents in her wonderful book, Marginalia, Readers Writing in Books. Readers have been writing in the margins of print texts for centuries. She also points out that these annotations serve a wide range of purposes. Sometimes the reader's annotation is an attempt to enter into a conversation with the author. Sometimes the annotation just registers a reaction. It might be an exclamation point, a question mark, a heart. Sometimes the annotation is a cross-reference. Sometimes it's more like the kind of editorial note that we find in a scholarly edition, explaining an allusion or providing historical context, the kind of thing that Elissa was showing us in her Scalar project a short while ago. There's even a long tradition of social annotation in print texts, notes scribbled in the margin that are meant to be read by other readers. The historian Anthony Grafton has described how various 17th century political figures in England shared copies of books on politics, responding to one another's marginal notes in them. So in one sense, digital annotation, even social digital annotation, doesn't introduce anything new. But at the same time, we can see that this very old practice takes on some new dimensions when we're in a digital space. We can share social annotations much more easily, rapidly, and widely than print ones. And this greater ease, speed, and reach of annotation makes annotation useful in new ways for teaching and learning. Online annotators can build on one another's insights, share contextual knowledge that they find through research, and argue with each other as well as with the text. So today I'll say something quickly in turn about 3 specific tools, certainly not the only ones, but 3 that I've used that you can use with your students for these purposes. One is Hypothesis, and I put a link to that one in the chat. It's a browser extension that allows you to add an annotation layer over virtually any page you find on the web and keep it private, share it publicly, or share it more narrowly with a designated group. Another is CommentPress, a plugin to the popular web content management system WordPress, which lets you put one or more texts on your own WordPress website and then allow others, such as your students, to add comments in the margin tied to particular paragraphs or lines. And the third is plain old Google Docs, which, as you probably already know, allows users to select bits of text, comment on them, and even reply to one another's comments. So next slide, please. Here's what a typical hypothesis annotation looks like. The nice thing about hypothesis is that, as I said earlier, you can use it to annotate just about anything on the web. Hypothesis annotations aren't part of the website that you're annotated. They exist in a layer over that website. They're served from Hypothesis's servers. If you want your students to comment on a text that's in the public domain, say from Project Gutenberg, and I put a link to gutenberg.org in the chat as well, which is where I found this copy of Dickens's Great Expectations. You can just send them there and tell them to start annotating. All you or your students need to start using Hypothesis is a free account. A nice feature of Hypothesis is that you can format text in your annotation, and you can even insert other media into it, such as images. Next slide, please. CommentPress takes a somewhat different approach. Here's that same first paragraph of Great Expectations on a CommentPress site. In this instance, we have to take the content of Dickens's novel from Gutenberg's site, that's what I've done here, and put it into our own WordPress site. CommentPress annotations also accept formatting and media files, just like Hypothesis, and they handle embedded content from services like YouTube and SoundCloud really well. So you can ask students to create annotations in which they embed related content. Both Hypothesis and CommentPress comments have their own URLs, which is a nice feature. It means you can link from a web page, a document, or an email right to a comment, or from one comment to another in either system. Next slide, please. Finally, there's no reason not to take a public domain text like Great Expectations and just plunk it into one or more Google Docs, asking your students to comment there. On the plus side, just about everyone knows how to do this, so the learning curve is minimal. On the minus side, Google Docs are very limited when it comes to the formatting that you can put into comments there, and they don't accept other media, and they don't live at their own URL, so you can't easily point to them. Next slide, please. You may be asking yourself, how does having my students annotate text differ from asking them to talk to each other in discussion forums? Here are some key differences. If I write a prompt for a discussion forum, I'm usually focused on getting my students to think about an idea. So forums are idea-centric. By contrast, annotation is a text-centric activity. The prompt isn't a question, but a bit of the text that we're reading together. Because forums tend to be idea-centric, the replies they generate are often abstract. By contrast, annotation gives students a concrete starting point for what they write and keep them focused on the relationship between ideas and text. The usual structure of a discussion forum is questions, most often generated by the instructor, followed by replies to the question. With annotation, again, the prompt is something concrete, a bit of text, and it feels natural to allow students a wider range of responses, not just replies, but for example, reactions or connections, as I mentioned before. Forums are more instructor-driven because it's usually, though it doesn't have to be, the instructor who sets the agenda through their questions. Annotation as an activity is a more learner-driven activity because it allows learners to pick the passages that speak to them in some way and then respond. And finally, forums seem designed mainly for conversation. Social annotation can also take the form of conversation. Hypothesis, CommentPress, Google Docs, they all support conversation threads. They're great for having a text-centric exchange of ideas, but annotation has always been about more than person-to-person exchange of ideas, and annotation can be a way for an annotator to enter a conversation with the text or with themselves. It can also be, as I said earlier, a place for simply registering a reaction, a smile, an angry face, an exclamation point, or a fully articulated response. And an annotation activity can be one that sends the students out to do elucidating and contextualizing research, pin that research to the text, and then share it with others in the class. Next slide, please. This is the last one. Just a few examples of annotation assignments that you might give. You can ask students to find a passage in a text related to some idea you've been talking about in class, and then explain in the margin how the passage treats the idea. If you tell them they all have to find different passages, you don't run into the problem that you sometimes have with discussion forums, where after the first few answers, everyone else just repeats what the first responder said. You can ask them to find a passage that they can relate in some way to their own experience and write about the connection. You can ask them to find two related passages and leave an annotation on each, explaining how they're connected. In Hypothesis and CommentPress, these comments, as I mentioned before, can be hyperlinked to each other. You can ask them to find a passage that just makes them feel joy, wonder, confusion, or anger, and then tell them you want to explain the reason for their reaction. And I'll end with one assignment idea that's on the right side of the slide. that demonstrates, among other things, that you don't have to limit annotation exercises to the main texts in a class. A terrific exercise at the beginning of the semester is to ask students to annotate the syllabus. If you allow them to do that anonymously, which is easy to do in Google Docs, you'll create a space for students to safely ask what they're afraid will sound like dumb questions. And you can also ask them to annotate the syllabus in the middle of the semester and at the end, telling them you want them to indicate which assignments they like best, what readings were most meaningful to them, or how they understand one of the course's learning outcomes differently now at the end of the semester from how they did at the beginning. So that's it. Don't know how I did for time, Chris. I was going to time myself, but never press the button.
Yeah, you did great. I mean, there's 2 minutes left. So, I mean, I got questions, but I'm going to wait and I get to talk to you all the time. So I'll wait, see if anybody else has questions. Any other questions? Any questions?
Yeah, I had a quick one. Thank you. Yeah, and that was, you blew my mind a little bit there with that comparison of the forums to the annotation, because I mean, everything you said there about I teach my piracy course, the undergraduate and graduate, primarily online. And so everything you said there, I was kind of reeling about, you know, the problems of the forums and that idea of annotations as being text-centric as opposed to forums being idea-centric, I think kind of hits to a bunch of the crises I was trying to solve, even in doing my own project. I was trying to get this material in there and point at the text, you know, and get them to engage and wrestle with it with me. And I know that actually Scalar has hypothesis built into it, that it already has it, I believe, as part of the universe. So you really inspired me to go, particularly for my graduate students that I'll be teaching in the fall. I think you've created a little summer project. I'm just curious, when you mentioned that, you know, you can have students working on this anonymously or as a group and whatnot. I wonder if have you ever done sort of an equivalent with sort of groups, asking students to work in groups with this, or sort of how you found the actual logistics of how you're breaking out the process of annotation to work on the various projects?
I have had students work in groups in the classroom, right, where we're meeting together, and I asked them to break out into physical breakout groups in the classroom, and I asked them to work on an annotation together. And so one person is responsible for for the text entry, but they talk together about what they would like to say about a passage, and then they put it in. And then if I have 5 or 6 different breakout groups, after they put them in, I can ask each of those groups to reply to the comment that one of the other groups put in. I really do find that this does, it keeps them focused on the text, right? I don't have to read a discussion forum answer and then have to kind of go back to the student to say, can you give an example, right? Or could you be more concrete? The starting point is already concrete, and they're already talking about something in the text.
And that's really interesting too, because you know that gets me to thinking of one of the main objections certainly I've had in my own work with digital humanities is that, you know, that something is being lost by not being in the stacks. The fact that I'm working with some sort of lesser reproduction, and I think that's sort of a great battle cry in the name of the digital humanities, is to say in some ways it's letting you handle the material more directly than we otherwise would be allowing students to do. You know, we're actually in being text centric rather than idea centric. So that's really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So we're actually doing really well on time. We might have a little bit of time at the end for questions, more questions for everyone, but we're going to turn to our last presenter now, Leandra. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Good. All right. My name is Leandra Smollin. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at SUNY Potsdam, and I am co-coordinator of an interdisciplinary human services program. So next slide. Thank you. So today I'm going to discuss a strategy that I came up with to engage students and build community using structured group work that centralizes digital engagement. So 2020 was a crazy year for teaching. While we had more time to prepare for virtual teaching prior to the fall semester, one of the advantages that I was concerned about that we weren't going to have was a class of students who had at one point known or at least seen their classmates. So as I was planning the courses for the fall, I was feeling concerned about that. I was feeling concerned about the impact that that may have on students individually, their ability to form a sense of community, as well as the challenges that this may pose for student engagement during our synchronous class meetings on Zoom. While, you know, sociology and human services courses are obviously people-centric, we're talking about issues of engaging with others, and human services, you know, working with students who are going to go out and directly be working with human populations, that engagement in the classroom is part of what, you know, is the learning. So I was trying to figure out how to accomplish this in a virtual environment. And you know, finally, the last consideration that I had in mind was that I was grappling with the way that these changes to our social world limited what I saw as the scope of possibilities for applied learning. So with all of that in mind, my strategy was to create a plan for structured semester-long small group work where students would actually draw from the digital environment in which we are now living, learning, doing our social activities. I separated groups of students into 4 or 5. They were essentially a team for the course of the semester. Every week, students would meet with a small group, their small group, for the first scheduled class. And then the second scheduled class of the week, we'd meet together synchronously. During their small group meeting, they would discuss course material, they'd find documents, images, resources. It depended on what the topic and assignment was for the week, but they would find these things online and then they would collaborate to complete a small task in preparation for our class day where we all met together. So how I prepared this, basically set up a space for group engagement. We have Microsoft Teams at SUNY Potsdam, but you could also easily do this using Google or creating some type of shared space in the learning management system that you have. Second step was to create weekly individual assignments to add on to the assigned readings that I had previously had scheduled for students to complete in preparation for class, and then come up with a weekly task or activity for the small group to complete that could be completed in one class period. And then the fourth was to create a space for the group to submit their work. I had a weekly channel in Teams, or you could use a weekly forum in a learning management system, but someplace where the small group work could be essentially handed in and also accessed by other students. Next slide, please. So the next slide is an example of the steps and also what 1 week of structured group work might look like for a class. So each student would prepare individually for the week. They would complete any assigned readings and a related individual task. So the individual task that I would ask students to complete, I might ask them to find an example of existing training materials relating to a specific topic we were focusing on, like adverse childhood experiences. How do community organizations train their staff on that topic? I might ask them to do an image search or use social media to find examples of differing viewpoints on a topic. I might ask them to search for or create a meme or find a primary source that could help educate someone else on an issue or educate them to prepare them for the small group task. So if we were talking about historical trauma, for example, perhaps the students would, elect to find an interview with someone from, say, an Indigenous community discussing the contemporary impact of the boarding school era. A lot of the opportunities that students had to find materials were structured in the sense that I would assign them to find a certain type of material. but at the same time, in terms of the actual content, they had a lot of flexibility to kind of approach this in a way that, made sense to them. So by the time that they would arrive to their group meeting, they would have already prepared for the topic for the week on their own by reading. They would have already engaged with the topic for the week a little bit through their own efforts to find materials in our digital world, to engage with the topic in accordance with the instructions that I had given them. They would either find those materials or create them. And then when they met with their group, they were expected to complete some type of small task. So on the screen, you'll see a couple of examples. In this case, what fit best in this slide were some examples of an assignment where students were asked to either identify or create an image or a video to explain the concept of a strengths-based approach to someone working in the human services field. During a different week, I had students search social media posts about COVID-19 and then use them to help figure out how to create a targeted health promotion material for a certain community. So, are there differences in rural versus urban communities in terms of social distancing? What would be most effective? What conversations are people having out there that might inform how you would, do outreach in a community in your job in the future? Then when we met for the scheduled class day, I would find a way to incorporate this work into the class. I might ask for a recap of how their discussion went, like a process-oriented thing. I might display one of their images. If the assignment was like to create an infographic, I might have that up on the screen for them to enter the Zoom room and just be able to view that for a while, while we were kind of, everyone was joining the room and getting situated. In some cases, I would, compare outcomes between the groups in terms of how they completed the task. So why did one group use only images to communicate something, whereas another group chose to use data and graphs? Throughout this, there's a lot of opportunity to monitor group participation, performance, and outcomes. So, when I've talked about this with colleagues, they'd say, well, you're not there teaching them for one class day a week. Don't you feel like you're missing out on the time that you need to be teaching the students? But actually, I found that the students' experiences of finding their own materials and then having structured assignments to kind of lead them through how to then take those materials and use them for a specific purpose and apply them to what we have been working on in class was actually a really valuable applied way to engage with material. So, you could self and peer assessment. That was one of the main ways that I learned about how things were going in the group. But I also had the chance every single week to review the outcome of the group work. During some weeks, I asked them to post the individual work into their group before they all met together. I would be able to, see who did that on time, what they came up with. They were meeting in teams, so oftentimes, I would be there available for when they were meeting in their small groups. If they made use of that more in the beginning, closer to the end, they seemed to solve their problems on their own more. But when they're in their teams groups and meeting in their small groups, I was able to see who is, present in the video chat just by going to their group. So to wrap up, the main strengths of this that, in doing my own evaluation after the course had ended, continuity, the structure of the meetings, when the assignments were due, where the students had to be, all of that remained the same. It was just, the actual little tasks that they had to complete. Students appreciated the continuity because one of the things that students seemed to struggle with, or at least had been struggling with before they were getting, as they're getting used to this new learning environment, is, jumping between platforms and keeping track of what they had to do for each of their classes. The prep work, the students had to problem solve, find the digital materials. They had to consider how existing text and materials could be used in new ways. They engaged with their peers to complete a time-specific goal. And they were able to identify and generate digital material for us to engage with as a class. Students who generally, didn't like group work reported that they appreciated this. They got to know some of their classmates better. They learned how to work as a team. And they seemed to have a sense of ownership over the things that they produced. What I liked about it achieved the aims that I was concerned about. It seemed like students were empowered by the activities. It fostered a community of learners, and they had consistent opportunities to collaborate. There was structure and accountability to the group work, whereas sometimes in other classes, that was one of the struggles that I had with, putting students in group, like, were the discussions actually happening? Were they effective? And then it prepared students to engage in our synchronous class meetings. So I am happy to talk more if anyone has any questions about, thank you. Yes, thank you. And I'm happy to talk more about how this might look in a lower level class, because I presented mostly on the class that it was most effective for, but I also tried this with an introductory level course. And it was also effective, but it looked a little bit different. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Leandra. So we have 8 minutes left, and that could be questions for Leandra or anyone else at this point, since everybody, and I have to thank you all for pretty much being on time and giving us a little bit extra time here. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to bring up the slide with all your names on there so that we could start from there. So let's do that so everyone remember who presented what. So I know there's been some questions for Paul in the chat. I don't know, Paul, or are there any questions for Leandra first off, I guess, since you just completed your presentation? I actually had a question about quizzing. I know with team-based learning, Leandra, that quizzing is usually a big part of it, like individual quizzes and group quizzes. And I didn't see that. If you did and said it, and I just didn't hear it, I apologize, but it doesn't look like that's part of the way you do things. Is that true?
Apologies, on mute. No, basically, the purpose of having them work in these groups was for them to have the experience of engagement, to be able to, do some problem solving and, meet the outcomes that I would then use in the class. So it wasn't really about, assessing outcomes per se. It was more about the process of learning.
Right. I know. I used to use group-based learning in my political thought class and team-based learning, and they would do the quizzes just so they were prepared to kind of do the team activity. You know what I mean? So that you wouldn't have students coming like not prepared at all. But it sounds like you kind of get there from what they have to put that the project together, and so that seems like that's, if they're not doing it, then they have assessments for their peers, right? So that's how they will report on those who are not holding their weight, I guess.
Yeah, and it seemed like there was some amount of shaming for people who arrived unprepared, so kind of solved its own problem.
Thanks.
That's a good idea, though.
All right. Any other questions for any of other presenters? Is there anything that anybody wants to ask? And I just have to say, I thought all of them were outstanding, so thank you all. I know there are a bunch of questions coming at you, Paul. Do you want to summarize anything? Is there anything you weren't able to address in the chat?
I tried to answer all the really, really good questions. The first one from Amy, I think, is really interesting about asking students to use hypothesis on a site where publicly visible comments have been left by other people, and say, go there, see what other people have said, and engage. You can find lots of, anything that's a sort of trending topic, important news item. You'll find often lots of hypothesis comments, and you can ask your students to engage with those. And then, as I said in the chat, they feel like they're part of a larger conversation. I think one of the really difficult questions that doesn't have an easy answer, and that I sometimes just talk to the students about, is how comfortable they are sharing their own comments publicly. So one thing hypothesis enables you to do is to create a dedicated group just for your students, and then those comments are only seen by members of the group. With all these tools, there are ways to adjust those permissions, but I think it's really important to have that conversation with students, and certainly not to force students out into making publicly visible comments if they're not comfortable with doing it. Some other questions in there about different platforms like VoiceThread and Perusal, and as I said to Michael Kramer, I think the most important thing is just, the activity itself. Lots of different tools for doing it. It's the activity that's the key thing.
Actually, speaking of Michael, he asked a good question here to all of the presenters. What about sustainability of the digital tools you're using, and what will you do if the tool you are using stops being maintained? So does anybody want to address that?
That's definitely like something I fear a lot, Chris, and with the way that I'm gathering a lot of the sources I use. So I've tried to work with my library team to create these research guides and resource guides that kind of live there. And it also helps me with record keeping, but I definitely fear it. So I need to think about that and address that quickly. And I have to pop off for another meeting, but thank you all.
Thank you,
I'm
Nicole.
Totally inspired.
Thanks, Nicole. Anybody else with it? Yeah.
Well, one thing I would say about this that connects up to Amy's presentation, I'm always asking myself about a tool, whether the content that's being generated with it can be pulled out and archived and potentially be recreated in some other way. And that's in my reply to Michael about VoiceThread. That was one of my concerns. I don't know with Perusal, but with the open source tools, typically, everything can be exported as plain text, or into a spreadsheet of some kind, and then you figure out what other tool maybe it could be imported into so that you can recreate your project. But yeah, I think it's a really important, sustainability is a really important issue.
I think with tools like VoiceThread and LMS tools, the tools that are the more proprietary tools, a lot of times it's more convenience than anything else, than functionality. I mean, that's not to kind of knock convenience, right? I mean, that's what we pay for in most of our tools. But I think, as you mentioned, you can often get that sort of flexibility if, but you may be a little bit more of a learning curve with some of the other tools, but not always, right? I'm sure there are plenty of free tools out there, that open source tools that are perfectly convenient to use. Actually, that was my question, Paul. I mean, I immediately go to, if I did, I use discussion forums heavily in my courses, and and the only thing stopping me from doing what you're doing with some of the text is just like, okay, so will it be really easy for me to grade them? And I hate to admit that, but that's just the truth, right? For a lot of people. Yes.
No, that's a really important consideration, right? So you can you want it to be easy to grade them. You might also be interested again, connecting to Amy's presentation, in analyzing that text data, right? So you've had lots of students say things about a text. Now, if you start to use Python or R or some other tool to try to figure out what the patterns are in the comments, right? So how accessible is that data to you, either for purposes of grading or doing text analysis? I think those are really important considerations.
Maybe we just need to rethink grading too. That's the other piece, right? But I think that's sort of
Yes.
what you're suggesting. Right, exactly.
Not maybe, yes.
Yes.
One of the things I was going to say, new tools might require new assessment methods, and I'm interested in labor-based grading contracts and self-evaluation and things like that. And I try to incorporate that with service learning projects, because when you're creating materials for a client, there's really a sort of binary logic to it. Either they like it and use it, or they don't. And so we try to kind of navigate that. I have students do other sorts of projects that kind of wrinkled my assessment of it. I've had them create public-facing instruction manuals, and one of my students now has 20,000 views on Instructables.com. And I told the class, I don't need to evaluate this because it's already been validated by the crowd, essentially. So it was a fun experience as well.
Very cool. Well, yeah, it is very awesome. So anyway, we are at time, and I want to be sensitive and to all your schedules and your time. So I think we're gonna call it there. But I do want to thank you all for coming today, and especially to our presenters. And I will just do my own applause, and everybody else I'm sure is doing it as well. And this is our second one that we had, and we'll make the recording available, of course, to anyone that registered, as well as the slide deck. And you'll probably be in touch with a short survey for those who attended, just to get their thoughts about other types of things we can do around digital pedagogy in the humanities. I mean, again, our goal here is to create a kind of community of practice of those who are doing this work. And so we'd like to see it continue. And I think we have plenty of folks in SUNY who can help contribute and be members of this community. So thank you all again.
Thanks.
Thank you.